Okay, so I'll be leading today's discussion. So in in First Kings chapter 13, from verses 1 to 10, we see that as the Lord had commanded, a man of God went to Jeroboam at his altar in Bethel while he was offering sacrifices. And this prophet had prophesied against Jeroboam, saying that one day God would raise up a man named Josiah, and he would defile Jeroboam's unholy altar by burning human bones on them. When Jeroboam had attempted to have the prophet arrested, his hands were suddenly paralyzed, and the altar tore apart. So after seeing this, Jeroboam instantly begged the prophet to pray for him, and his hands were restored. Jeroboam invited the man of God to his house for a feast, but the prophet rejected his offer because God had forbid him from eating or drinking with anyone in that place. Next, we see that an old prophet who lived in Bethel, he heard about the events that happened at Jeroboam's altar, and so he set out to find that man of God that was mentioned from the previous verses. When he had found him sitting under an oak tree, he invited him to his house to eat. But still, like before, the younger prophet refused to break the commands given by God of not eating or drinking from the place. So the old prophet told him that an angel spoke to him and told him to invite the young prophet, which was a lie that he had made up. So the prophet took his word and went with him to his house. After they had eaten, the young prophet continued his journey on his donkey, but on his journey back home, he was attacked and killed by a lion for disobeying God. And so, although the lion did not eat him, it stood by the body in the road. And so, when the old prophet found what had happened, he recovered and gave the body a proper burial. So he put the body in his own tomb and asked his sons to bury him with the young prophet when he dies as well. And then, even after all this had happened, Jeroboam did not repent, and he continued down his path of sin, and appointed more priests at the high places, which further misled the worship of God. Now, in chapter 14, we see that Jeroboam's son, named Abijah, fell very sick, and so Jeroboam told his wife to disguise herself and take a gift as an offering to prophet Ahijah and ask him what would happen to their son. And due to Ahijah's poor eyesight, God had revealed the identity of his visitor to him. So he had told her that he had bad news for her about her son and her husband's kingdom. Since Jeroboam had promoted idol worship and turned away from God, God was going to turn away from him and bring destruction to him. Through Ahijah, God cursed Jeroboam's house, telling him that his relatives that had already died would be eaten by dogs and birds, all except for Jeroboam's sixth son. He would be the only one to receive a proper burial and would die the moment his wife enters the city. Ahijah also prophesied that the nation of Israel would be uprooted from their good land and would be scattered. Jeroboam died after reigning for 22 years and was replaced by his son Nadab. Rehoboam took charge and became king of Judah at 41 years old and reigned for 17 years. And under his leadership, Judah was very ungodly. They worshipped idols and acted like the pagan nations. The fifth year of Rehoboam's reign, Shishak, I believe, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem and took all their treasures from their temple and the king's house. This led to the continual war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Rehoboam died in the city of Jerusalem, and his son Abijah later became the next king.
All right, thank you, Joanna, for that summary of those two chapters. Um, I didn't get to write down discussion questions for these chapters, so it's really open. It's free for all, you know. At any point in these two chapters, what do we want to talk about first? You know, there are little things. It doesn't, it doesn't have to be, what you think like the biggest moment of the summary is. It could just be something small. For example, I can get it going with first thing I noticed with chapter 13, like starting from verse 1, right? Behold, a man of God came out of Judah by the word of the Lord to Bethel, uh, where Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make offerings. So we already know from the previous chapters that God raised up Jeroboam, as part of the judgment upon like Solomon and his descendants, because of how like Solomon and his descendants forgot the Lord. Um, God took like it, there was a considerable diminishing of David's throne, but God couldn't completely forget David because of that covenant. But Jeroboam, who was like basically like he's not, he's totally uninvolved with the entire story until, God sees him, God chooses him, and God like calls him, anoints him through like that prophet, Ahijah. And after that, like he's just been given a calling. But we see as soon as he receives that authority, as soon as he receives, and he has the majority of the tribes, correct? Yeah, Rehoboam, like David's grandson Rehoboam, has only two tribes, barely two tribes, right? Like Judah and Benjamin. And sometimes I read somewhere that the reason that they refer to him only getting one tribe is how, when you look at the land, how it's like divided amongst the tribes. Benjamin only has like a tiny portion inside the territory of Judah. So it's as if like the whole thing is Judah. But anyway, Jeroboam, the one not related to David, right, has the majority of what was once known as the United Kingdom of Israel, right? The United People of Israel. He has all the other tribes. But we know that with all this power authority, he became like Saul. I don't remember who brought it up last time, but someone brought it up, like the connections to Saul. Saul became so, paranoid over keeping his power and authority that he forgot who gave it to him, right? God gave it to him for a purpose, but Jeroboam forgot that and led the people astray. He made idols for them to worship, golden calves, not one, but two, and set them up for the people to worship so that they would not go back to, you know, Rehoboam's territory to worship at the temple of God, that, as we know, Solomon spent years making, right? What a shame, isn't it? Remember that whole dedication prayer that Solomon prayed over that temple, only for it not to be used, like barely used after his death. His kingdom being torn to two. It's all a mess. And we know the root causes of that mess. These people compromising, going astray, forgetting their God. You know, again and again, God deals with it. Okay, sorry. All that was just exposition, just to say. This prophet comes to Bethel. That's where Jeroboam is offering the sacrifices at the altar. Do you guys remember the first time we see mention of Bethel? Bethel wasn't always called Bethel. It was named Bethel by Jacob. The original name of the place was Luz, and it was named Bethel. Does anybody potentially remember like what was happening during that time in Jacob's life and what like Bethel has to do with it? Well, we know that Jacob was running away from Esau, right? His brother, because Jacob took the birthright, like tricked Esau out of the birthright. And as he's running away, um, he, once like night falls, he arrives at this city called Luz, and it's like a point of his life. Like he doesn't have anything. He grew up with family, with provisions, but with everything. But now, like for the first time in his life, he's like running away and he's fending for himself. And he finds a boulder, a large stone to use as like a pillow, as a thing to rest his head. And he's sleeping there. And God shows him a vision in his sleep, of like this ladder connecting heaven and earth and angels going up and down that ladder. And, you know, God basically promises, to sustain him, right? Through that vision encourages Jacob. And when Jacob wakes up, he, like this rock that he was sleeping on, like he positions it, anoints it with oil, and makes that place a worship place for God, and calls its name Bethel. Instead of its original name Luz, he calls it Bethel, and he makes a vow saying, God, if you won't abandon me, I don't have much, I don't have anything at all. But, if you bless me, then when I return back home, um, like me and everything that you give me, I will worship you properly at this altar that I'm setting up here. That's just like the beginning of the story, right? Later, we've talked about everything about Jacob, like how he's unable to keep that vow and stuff. But like the significance of Bethel is that it's supposed to be a place of worship. It's supposed to be a place where your hopelessness changes into hope because of the encouragement and the visions and the promises that God gives you, right? But what's so wrong about this picture? What's happening at Bethel right now, though? According to verse 1 of chapter 13. Is worship still happening there? Sure. But what's wrong?
Jeroboam wasn't not he was not a Levite, and you see him doing the like the burning of the incense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also something that was like unique to Jeroboam as well. Like he went out of his way to like break as many, like, command, like it's so crazy, the switch up, right? It shows us we are Jeroboam many times in our lives as well. God, when he chooses to judge people who are more qualified than us, or like people who were chosen from like generations past, like Rehoboam, like his lineage is legendary, right? Like his grandpa is David, right? So, and his dad is Solomon, right? You would expect, like, but like God rejected Rehoboam because Rehoboam rejected God and chose Jeroboam. But now Jeroboam is actively rejecting God in every possible way. But yeah, like you said, Reba, I mean, not only is he the one who's offering worship, there is nothing here that should indicate to us that he's offering to God, the true God, at all, right? Because isn't Jeroboam the same person who instituted the two golden calves for Israel to worship? Now, from this point onwards, realize when I say Israel, well, if I like, well, I guess, yeah, we're gonna just have to specify, but like Israel and Judah, they exist as two at this point, right? Judah is referring to the kingdom of Judah under Rehoboam, and Israel is referring to the kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam. It used to be all one united Israel. It's not anymore. Okay, anyway. Yeah. So no one is in Israel is worshiping the true and living God anymore due to the things that Jeroboam set up. So there's nothing here that should make us think that, you know, the sacrifice that Jeroboam is offering at the altar at Bethel is to God. You know, he might as well be. He's turning Bethel into a high place, is what's happening. Yeah. What else, guys, from this chapter that catches your attention, or makes you, wonder or question anything? Anything that surprises you?
Um, this chapter we see that how there was a false prophet pretty much. We also should be wary of these false prophets as like they could be like known as the holiest man on earth, but they may have the wrong intentions for us. Like they can bring us down the wrong path or to fall in like an idol. So we should like test all these things, which is uh, stated in 1 John 4 verses 1. Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world.
No, amen. Well said, Kevin. Because, yeah, because when you're like when you're hearing the story for the first time, you're like, oh my gosh, right? This prophet, from where was he from? He came out of Judah, so he went from the territory of Judah to the territory of Israel for the sole purpose of telling Jeroboam that if he doesn't get his act together, like that, like just proving to Jeroboam that he's going down a destructive path that is displeasing to God, right? And he was obviously like a bold man, like a person who was empowered by God, because he went up there, he told King Jeroboam what God wanted to say, and when Jeroboam was like, "Oh, seize him," like the power of God worked on this man's behalf, right? Like King Jeroboam's hand became shriveled in that very instant, right? So all of these great feats and deeds, and this prophet um prophesying that, oh, this false altar will be like torn down, ashes shall be poured out, and it happened as he said it would, right? And he says, he goes as far as to like prophesy about a future king who will end Jeroboam's throne, all of these things, right? Such power, this prophet refuses to compromise when King Jeroboam, after his hand is restored, invites this prophet, in to dine with him, right? But later, like you said, Kevin, he doesn't test the, you know, the other prophet, the older prophet, who invites him in. And I feel like there's like some deeper spiritual significance to this, because, or which you already like summed up, Kevin. But if I were to pick at it more, it would be like, obviously this prophet from Judah is gonna say no to Jeroboam when Jeroboam invites him into his house to eat and drink, right? Because the prophet's like, no, God told me not to eat or drink anything as I am out on this mission, right? I can't do that until I go home. And he's like adamant about it. He refuses to budge, because I imagine Jeroboam, probably didn't just ask him once, right? Because Jeroboam witnessed like the power of God working with this man. So he probably asked more than once, but this man was adamant. He stood firm. But later with this prophet, he does say the same thing. He says, I can't, I mean, like, what God commanded me is to not eat and drink. He says that, but, he's convinced by the false word that this prophet speaks. So people can speak false words, and the shame is that there's too many people in this world right now who are believers, right? And not just like like nilly believers, people who are actually strong, people who actually know the word, people who are like this young prophet who God has been using to speak boldly in front of like corruption, and speak boldly before things that displease God, speak boldly before sin, people who have had God's power be manifested, like, through them, like, to give them authority, right? And defend them, among like the world, in the midst of the world. And um all of that just to say, like, it's crazy how such a man, such a prophet, would fall to a false word. That other prophet straight up lied. It says so too, right? He lied. He said, "Oh no," like an angel said that it's like fine, you can like down here. One thing is that God is not a God of confusion, right? God never operates like that. Tell one person one thing, another person another thing. Let's just make, a huge mess. Let's have some fun, sow a little seed, like seeds of chaos everywhere. That's not our God. When you look at different mythologies, right, you find that there are certain gods who are known to be people of mischief, right, or deities of mischief. Like that's their whole MO. They like exist to cause some kind of mischief and chaos and confusion somewhere, right? That's their sole purpose. But our God, the true and living God, he doesn't operate like that. He doesn't operate with confusion. The thing is, the younger prophet wouldn't like. I refuse to believe that. Like it wasn't as if he was going into a random prophet's house. This older prophet, had to have been someone who knew the true and living God, right? Like someone who wasn't like bowing down to the things that Jeroboam was building. Obviously, right? Like, is that isn't that why the older prophet's like, oh my gosh, where's this guy? I need to meet him. I need to host him at my home because wow, look at him. Look at how God used him to preach, to prophesy against King Jeroboam, right? So it's kind of like this is awesome. I need to shake this guy's hand almost, but like, it's like it's a prophet, it's an older prophet who knows like who the true and living God is. So that's why the younger prophet went inside his home, because the younger prophet wouldn't be going inside some like another person's home and or listening to them as they're like politely forcing them to eat food and stuff if it wasn't a person who knew God. And that's the dangerous part. So you can be and I can be led astray by people who call themselves Christians and who may have like listened to the Lord's voice in the past, right? Because that old man is referred to as a prophet. He was a prophet, but he's speaking false prophecies. So when we say watch the friendships that you make, or be careful of the counsel that you receive or the counsel that you listen to and do, right? It may be coming out of the people who appear to be believers, but it, like Kevin said, if you don't test that word, if you this young prophet, he had to have such a close connection with God, right? Otherwise, why would he barge up to King Jeroboam and speak all these things unless God had sent him? And obviously God did, right? That's why we have this young prophet knows about this whole thing, commandment. Okay, I can't eat until I go back home. Who told him that? God, obviously, right? So like he has a strong connection with God. If for whatever reason that seed of confusion was sown, couldn't that young prophet have just asked God, like, God, I know what you told me, right? But this seed of confusion is here, right? Affirm your word to me again, or give me the strength to overcome this like temptation, anything. But he doesn't. He too easily trusts what is offered to him in packaging that appears holy, right? So in relation to our message of holiness, a lot of things can appear holy, a lot of people can appear holy, a lot of the word that they speak can seem holy. They're quoting like not quote like they're like name dropping the same God. The older prophet was saying, "Oh no, but like the angel of God told me this," right? And the younger prophet's like, okay, maybe this guy's legit, right? Like, watch out what you know what you or what you receive to be true from other people, like whether they like be believers or not. Test it with the word of God. See if it aligns with or remains true with the things that God, that the word of God says that God has given you, the commandments that he has given you. And if there's some kind of contradiction, you have to pray over, you have to see. You can't just accept contradictions and end up doing something that is a sin to God. What a tragedy, right? Because this young prophet, God could have done so much more through him, but his life ends there. Like sadly, his life ends there, and it's such a tragedy. It's a shame. Yeah. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah. What else, guys?
One question I had when reading the chapter was, why did the prophet who lied and used the Lord's name to lie to this young prophet from Judah not get punished, but instead we see in verse 21 that God still uses that old prophet to speak through to him to deliver a message to the younger prophet?
Yeah, that's something that I was wondering about too, and I didn't get enough like a chance after like the nursing home service today. I wanted to come home and look at it more, but I didn't get a chance to. But that's exactly the same question that I had as well. Maybe I don't know. Now this is just me like thinking, right? It's like this old prophet, right? He's still a prophet who knows about the true and living God, but he's like faded and jaded and he's not being used at all by God, right? So the expectations that God has for him, you know, are very low. Like, he calls himself a prophet, but he's, like you said, lying about what God said. And he doesn't have a problem doing that, right? He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't think twice about putting false words in God's mouth, like saying words and claiming that God told him that when clearly God hasn't. And like there doesn't seem to be like any form of guilt or fear at all. So, maybe this man was used as a prophet before, but clearly not so much now, right? So, I don't know. Maybe he wasn't punished because this I don't know what was expected of that. This is what this man does, So it wasn't as if the man was like lying about God for the first time, or like the man was making compromises for the first time. Well, it's kind of crazy how. Okay, so what we can assume from this is this is implying that this man, this old prophet, who obviously knew the true and living God and knew that what King Jeroboam was doing was against God's commands. This man is not being sent out by God to say anything to King Jeroboam at all. And a young prophet from Judah was brought, right? Because this is Israel, right? The kingdom of Israel. A young prophet from Judah had to come all the way here and talk to King Jeroboam, while this old prophet was here the whole time. So like it's making me wonder, okay, like, God never called this old prophet because this is what this old prophet does. You know, he's gone already. He's already carrying himself out as someone he's fallen astray from God. So everyone has that appointed judgment at some point, but it's different for the young prophet because he is something who had to be that in tune with God, right? He had to be that in tune with God to be sent by God to Jeroboam to say all that, not just say, but also like perform wonders, right? Because it was, when Jeroboam says seize him and he's trying to, no finger can be laid upon a person, a prophet of God, right? A man of God, a worker of God. And like the king's hand shrivels up. So like it's like this that young prophet was keeping himself in greater holiness than the old prophet, right? The old prophet is someone who has already compromised holiness, has fallen out of that grace, that anointing. So God expected more out of the young prophet, I guess, right? Just like how, how, I mean, this is only like, I don't know, simple illustration. I don't know exactly if it fits all the way, but like, like kids who grow up without any parental figures, right? And if they disobey and if they, run buck wild, yeah, I mean, they're going to get punished for it, like, eventually, but that's not treated with the same severity as someone who has like knowledge of what to do, what not to do, who has the support, who has you know the support system, the covering, all that stuff. And if that person, like, gets it wrong, right? Even though it's a person who's been doing right, it's like a greater severity is upon the person who knows what the truth is, right? So yeah, I feel like it's closer to it's the answer to that. Yeah, because it was troubling me as well. But yeah, the old prophet was just that far gone already. So I guess his judgment would come in time, but his calling was he virtually had no calling in this respect, right? He's not involved in anything at all. But like the younger prophet, he was called for something greater. He was called in holiness. So yeah, realize that we guys, like, God's given us a calling, and God's given us the depths of his word, not so we can go on pretending like we don't know it, like acting and speaking and thinking and doing things as if we were people who don't know the word. People who don't know the word, right? And people who don't have a relationship with God, they will not get punished with the severity that we get punished because we know this all already. Yeah. But feel free to go back and forth, if there's something else that like counters this or something else that you want to like bring up. This isn't what I shared, doesn't have to be the end all be all, but that's just something that I received from like that like what we read, just looking back at comparing and contrasting the young prophet versus the old prophet. But yeah. Anything else? The same thing or anything else? Notice how Jeroboam only like treats the young prophet with respect or like seriously once his hand is shriveled. I mean, forget treating the young prophet with respect, right? Notice how Jeroboam says in verse 13, 13 verse 6. Jeroboam says to the man of God, the young man of God, entreat now the favor of the Lord your God and pray for me that my hand may be restored to me. Like, that's a huge shift from like the tone that Jeroboam was giving in the first verses of that chapter. Like, I don't know, like what does this remind you of? Or like what does this tell you about how far Jeroboam has fallen? We haven't known Jeroboam for a long time, not anywhere close to the time, like all the time we spent on Saul and David and Solomon, right? But from what we do know about him, what does this show about his fall? And if it helps, at the end of chapter 13, verse 33, 34, it says, after this thing, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way, but made priests for the high places again from among all the people. So even after being given warnings, he's returning back to the same sin. But does anybody remember? Go ahead, go ahead.
Well, actually, like the first part, it kind of like reminded me of like Saul and David. So like when we read back then, it was like Saul would like try everything to kill David, right? But then at the end, we read that Saul was very welcoming to David, and like that shift kind of like reminded me of like the first part that we read in chapter 3.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's crazy how many like parallels we're seeing from them. How one person is able to play like who is able to mirror a lot of different people at different points in their life. So, while you were talking about Saul, remember when we said how Solomon, near the end of his life, started like showing a lot of Saul? Because remember when God told Solomon, hey, I'm going to tear your kingdom into two because of the sin that you've been doing, because of the holiness that you've been compromising, because you've been using the wisdom I've given you to do worldly things, all of that, right? And that's when Jeroboam is anointed to be the king of Israel, right? At that point, like a contender for Solomon arises in Jeroboam. But if you remember, Solomon was trying to find an opportunity to kill Jeroboam, someone who God chose. Instead of trying to fix his own broken relationship with God, Solomon is trying to kill Jeroboam, someone who God was pleased in and was trying to choose to lead his people in a manner that honored God, right? So, like you said, that's Saul, right? And you could could you argue, okay, so in that instance, Jeroboam is kind of like David, right? Saul was trying to chase down David because Saul was envious about how David was more after God's heart. Saul was more envious, but now Solomon envious of how God is being pleased with Jeroboam, trying to kill Jeroboam, right? But like the issue is Jeroboam now is not Jeroboam then, right? God doesn't just choose people, just eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Like he saw something in Jeroboam. That's why he chose him. Same goes for Saul, right? God chose Saul to be the first king of Israel for a reason, because God saw something in him in the midst of all the timidness and the shyness and everything. God saw something, right? Or better put, God put capabilities in him to be used. But anyway, now we see Jeroboam like this is not going to have its full effect unless we read chapter 11 verse 31. Oh wait. Well, no. Okay. So that chapter 11 is basically that portion is where Ahijah the prophet is like calling Jeroboam and telling him that he's going to be like, a king for Israel because of how Solomon failed. Uh, 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 uh. Yeah, okay, so verse 33, 11 verse 33, if someone can read that. 33 just until no. Wait, read 33 first.
For Solomon has abandoned me and worshipped Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Molech, the god of Ammonites. He has not followed my ways and done what is pleasing in my sight. He has not obeyed my decrees and regulations as David his father did.
I like, not I like the true tone of God in this place it is yes, anger, there's that, but there's also sadness, there's hurt. How many times did God appear to Solomon in dreams, in visions, right? God gave Solomon wisdom. That wasn't acquired or like earned. God gave Solomon. How hurt is God feeling right now when Solomon is running after all these other gods and leaving the true God who loved him, who chose him, while Solomon was unqualified? God raised him up, and now what is God saying? He forsook me. How can God be right? How can God allow himself to be forsaken? Does that make sense? Why would God allow that to happen to him? That's what happens with us too. Why does God, I don't know, this is probably a blasphemous choice of words, but like God voluntarily is allowing him to be is allowing us to walk all over him. The point is that's not supposed to, you're not supposed to do that, right? So like what God is feeling is hurt. If we as human beings feel hurt when people use us or when people walk all over us and when people leave us for other things that don't love them as much as we do, like we've already talked about this, like about Saul. I remember like having these same sentences. We've talked about it before. But again, generation after generation after generation, it is God who continues to suffer with this hurt of a one-sided love, of a one-sided relationship. All right. Anyway, Ashtaroth, Chemosh, Milcom, all these gods, right? Solomon is out here building temples for all these gods that belong to his foreign wives, right? But who is God saying all this to? Jeroboam, right? Because Jeroboam is supposed to be someone who's more similar to David in this situation, right? But where do we see him in chapter 13 and 14? Forget Chemosh and Milcom and Ashtaroth. Jeroboam is out here making his own gods. You know, it's like it's like he's putting some creativity into it. He's making his own gods. It's crazy. Like how much, but then again, this is us. This is what we do. We are Jeroboam. We are Solomon, right? In our life, God calls us, God chooses us, God favors us, God blesses us. You know, God provides for us, God gives us peace. Like God reaffirms his covenant with us, all for us to turn our backs to him and continue to do abominable things to him, right? It's always about God, why are you doing this to me? And not, well, God is constantly asking, why are you doing this to me? Right? Okay. But verse 38. It's already 6:45. We had to wrap it up soon. But verse 37 and 38 of chapter 11. Sorry.
However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel, if you do whatever I command you and walk in obedience to me, and do what is right in my eyes by obeying my decrees and commands, as David's servant, as David my servant did. I'll be with you, and I'll build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and I'll give Israel to you.
Whoa, right? So like even though we haven't known Jeroboam for like pretty like a long time, we were only introduced to him like the last couple of chapters that we read. But from the few verses that we have of him, like do you see how much love God is shedding towards him? God is telling him, if you keep my command, God's not changing the rules for anybody. God is not a God of partiality. He's requiring the same holiness from Jeroboam, right? He's asking, can you please, like, if you listen to me, right? If you do what is right in my eyes, God says, I will take you, right? Like, don't worry about the how, the where, the when. I will take you. You shall reign over all your soul desires. God is saying, I will give you everything that your soul desires. You will be king. I will be with you. Like God is telling this man who has no relation to David at all. God is finding himself, I will be with you. If you God chose him and saying, I will be with you. I will build you a sure house. Right? I will give Israel to you. All right. I want you, this is the reason why I made us review these verses, right? Keep this in your head. What God is telling Jeroboam, right? What God is telling Jeroboam. Now let's go to chapter 13 and read verse 6 to me again. And this the king referred to here is Jeroboam, the same guy. Okay, verse 6. Verse 6.
The king answered and said to the man of God, please entreat the favor of the Lord your God, and pray for me that my hand may be restored to me.
Okay. Please entreat who? The Lord your God. As if Jeroboam doesn't know the God that this young prophet is talking about. Like, do you see the disconnect? This is the same God, Jeroboam, who told you, I will be with you. Right? This is the same God who said, I will give you Israel. But now, once Jeroboam has gotten the kingdom, gotten the authority, has, locked in the favor from all the people and making sure that he doesn't lose his power and his influence. And now he sees this young prophet, and I mean, at first he's about to kill the prophet. He's like, "Who is this guy? Why is he interrupting my sacrifices?" Right? And he's about to kill this young prophet, but that's when his hand shrivels up and he realizes, oh, this guy's kind of serious. So I should ask. Even then, do you see a hint of repentance? Do you see him realizing what he did wrong? No, he's saying, please pray to not just God. Jeroboam knows who this God is, right? Well, he knew who this God was before he became king, but now he's saying, entreat the Lord your God, not my God. Who was the one who talked about that? I feel like it was like Nevin and Tessin or somebody when we were talking about Saul, that one Bible study we were all sitting together, like in the house when we were all in person. When we were talking about Saul, like that, it's like a long time ago almost, but remember how like we were talking about the connections. Like, notice how Saul refers to God as, oh, when he's always talking about God, he's looking at Samuel and he's like, the Lord your God, the Lord your God. He doesn't. It's like impersonal. He doesn't have a personal connection with God. So in the same way, what started off as a personal relationship, Jeroboam is now so distanced from God, right? Because that's what compromising holiness will do to you. When you compromise holiness and you justify that with, oh, I'm just trying to look out for myself, I'm just trying to make sure that I stay king. Because I fully believe Jeroboam, this didn't happen overnight, right? He became king, and then we saw his thought process. He's like, I can't let these people go to where Rehoboam is just to worship in the temple of God. Like, I need to make sure they don't leave and Rehoboam doesn't take. Okay, like Jeroboam, like you didn't become king by yourself. You didn't get all these tribes of Israel to be under you by yourself. God allowed that to happen. So why aren't you taking those concerns with God? You're not supposed to be having those concerns at all. Like, you need to focus on the only thing that God asked of you, which was to keep my commandments, to listen to me, right? But now he's out here calling God. Oh, he's referring to this God as the God of this young prophet. And the only thing he's asking for is not mercy, not for God to restore the relationship that he himself broke, but rather, like Jeroboam himself broke, but rather, oh, fix my hand. Just fix my hand. It's crazy, right? But that's me. That's you. Yeah. At the end of chapter 30, verse 33, at the end of all these things, what we talked about, the young prophet, the old prophet, all that happened. And even after all that, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way, but made priests for the high places again. This thing became sin to the house of Jeroboam, so as to cut it off and destroy it from the face of the earth. Notice again, God shows no partiality. If you do not listen, God is not keeping anything a secret from these people. He's making everything crystal clear. But if you do the thing that God said would involve punishment, then obviously punishment is going to come. He's not God. It's simple. God's not complicated. God's not out to get you. He makes everything clear. He makes everything clear from the get-go. It's us who make God into the villain. But yeah. But think about how hurt he is, because it is God who chooses these people. So every time these same people basically step over him and disrespect him, right? It's, how is he feeling? God is caring about the fate of these people more than these people themselves, right? If it were up to the people, this nation would not exist. Like these people would not exist at all, or this way through which, or this heritage through which eventually Christ would come. Like, this would never, that we wouldn't have existed past, the Israelites traveling after Egypt, right? Okay. 6:53. We need to wrap up. Chapter 14 is Jeroboam's wife disguising herself to go to Ahijah, it's the same prophet who called, everything that we just read about God telling Jeroboam, oh, I will give you Israel, I will be with you, all of that was spoken through the prophet Ahijah. Ahijah was the one who went, brought this news to Jeroboam. So the craziest thing is Ahijah has been alive this whole time, right? Since Jeroboam, because Jeroboam was like given this calling, and then if you remember, Solomon was out to get Jeroboam. So Jeroboam spent a brief stint at Egypt, if you remember, to try to stay on the down low from Solomon, to try to not get killed, right? And Jeroboam only returned to Israel once he heard news that Solomon died. If you remember, that was like a couple of chapters ago, but yeah, before he received the calling that he was going to be, he was going to be ruler, and then that didn't happen until Solomon died, right? Which I guess is also another like parallel between Saul and David, but with these guys as well. But anyway, my point is, right, Ahijah was here the whole time. He's not gone. This guy is the one who God communicated to Jeroboam through. So Jeroboam has not been talking to Ahijah at all, which again showing his deteriorating relationship with God. So Ahijah, I mean, what's his name? Jeroboam eventually is at his his wits end. When his son is sick and dying, and he tried every other plan, and going to Ahijah is plan Z, right? That's how distanced Jeroboam is from God. So he sends his wife disguised to go to Ahijah, and again, Joanne already talked about everything in the summary. But yeah, even though this prophet Ahijah had dim eyesight because he was probably pretty old by then, right? Even though he was dim, his eyesight was dim because of his age, he still had spiritual vision to know the eyes of his heart were still open wide. He knew that it was Jeroboam's wife. Here's an example, right? So I guess this is implying where exactly was Ahijah? Go to Shiloh. Jeroboam tells his wife to go to Shiloh. I don't know exactly geographically. Like, I don't know where exactly Shiloh is. Is that in Judah or is that in Israel? I don't know. But my point being, and if it's in Israel, it makes it kind of interesting because Ahijah is still alive, and so is that other old prophet that we were just talking about, like the guy who said the false word from God. Yeah, it makes it kind of interesting that, okay, here's an example of a man of God, right? Ahijah, who never stopped being legit. He never stopped. He never had a gap in his connection with God. Ahijah is not out here spouting false revelations, right? He's old too, right? But his physical eyes have dimmed, but his spiritual eyes are still open and he can see clearly, right? But yeah. All right. The last thing, well, actually, okay, 56. Two things. Oh, unless anybody wants to say anything. I'm sorry. I don't mean to hog the time. Does anybody have any thoughts to share? Okay. And if eventually you do, you can always reach out about them. But notice in verse 13 of chapter 14, Ahijah refers to this sick son that they're coming to, that they're coming to Ahijah for help, or this woman, Jeroboam's wife, I guess the queen, I don't know, is that Ahijah's to ask about help for her sick son. And Ahijah says, only this son, I mean, like, Israel is going to mourn for him and bury him. For he only of Jeroboam shall come to the grave, because in him there is found something pleasing to the Lord. Something pleasing to the Lord. So, like, this is the only son or the only male descendant of Jeroboam who's ever going to have like a proper burial. Right? I don't know. There's too much to unpack from that as is. I mean, first of all, okay, we don't know if this kid knew God you know, and we don't know how deep that relationship was, but if God saw something in that kid to be pleased in, you know, I wonder. Maybe, I mean, that kid was done dirty because of how his dad. Here's another example of fatherhood gone wrong. We've talked about it with Saul, with David, with Solomon, and now we're talking about it with Jeroboam, right? I don't think Jeroboam invested time into telling his children about the true and living God. Jeroboam is out here making golden calves, making his own gods, making his own rituals. Jeroboam doesn't have time to care about God himself, right? He doesn't even acknowledge this God as his own God, as we just saw some verses ago. But it's a tragedy because what if Jeroboam had followed the conditions that God set before him way back when, before he became king? What if he kept the statutes of God, the commandments of God? What if he listened to God? What if he was after God's heart like David, right? History would have looked different, right? And not only that, this kid who is dying from an illness, right? I don't know. This kid has something in him, some kind of potential in him that God is pleased with. That is why this kid is the only one from Jeroboam's household who's ever going to have a proper burial, right? So imagine what could have been if things were different. What this kid could have grown to be, you know? All right, the last thing I want to mention is the whole reason why Jeroboam um didn't want the or no the whole reason Jeroboam made all these false gods and appointed false prophets for the false gods and false rituals for the false gods, so all like the false altars, false high places, all these things is because, like I said, he didn't want the Israelites going up to Judah or going down to Judah. Is Judah in the south? I think Judah's in the south. Going down to Judah to worship God in the temple of God, which is down there, or which I guess is whatever the territory of Rehoboam. He doesn't want his people to go down to where Rehoboam is because he's afraid that Rehoboam's going to steal his people, take influence away from him, right? The thing is, the temple of God, the grand, magnificent temple of God that Solomon spent years building, that David spent even more years dreaming about, right? That is not being used properly at all because notice in chapter 14, verse 22, and Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So Israel is under Jeroboam. Judah is under Rehoboam. Judah is doing evil in the sight of the Lord as well. And we knew from the get-go that Rehoboam did not have any relationship with God, right? But they did evil in the sight of the Lord. They provoked him to jealousy with their sins that they committed more than all that their fathers had done. So ever since these people have been going off the rails, like ever since the wilderness after like Egypt, right? This is referring to how, okay, in Rehoboam's time, these people were going buck wild to the point where all of the sins that their forefathers did together, and that's a lot of sin, right? The time of the judges, right? Everything. We talked about so many things, right? How many times have these people been going astray and coming back, going astray and coming back, going astray? All of that combined together is somehow still not coming close to the amount of debauchery and sin that was happening under the reign of Rehoboam. And Rehoboam is the one who has the temple. His daddy built the temple. The temple's right there. No one's out here worshiping, God in this temple. They built for themselves high place, like the temple is right under their nose, and they're building high places and pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there were also male cult prostitutes in the land. They did according to all the abominations of the nations that the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. Isn't this crazy? What are the chapters that I keep repeating like a broken tape record? Leviticus 18, 19, 18, 19. Everything that's happening there is being everything that the people that the land vomited out, all the Canaanites that God judged, all their practices, God's own people are doing it right now, and they're going to be judged accordingly. Even more so, because what Reba and I were talking about a little before, the Israelites know the truth. They knew the truth and they still spat in God's face. So how much greater would judgment be for them than for the Canaanites? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's just scratching the surface, but that's where chapters 13 and 14 leave us. And if that is all, we will close our discussion here.